Around 12,000 years ago, in what is now northern Israel, someone died and was buried. We don't know their name. We don't know how they lived. But we know one thing about how they were laid to rest, because the grave was carefully arranged. And tucked against the body, beneath the curve of their hand, was a young dog. Placed there, it seems, was something we can only call tenderness. The hand resting there on that small animal reaches across 12,000 years and touches something we still feel today when a dog rests his chin on our arm or a cat settles onto our chest. Today I want to explore this relationship, and this is an episode about the history of pets. But it's also about something bigger. It's about the long, sometimes beautiful, sometimes troubling story of how human beings have lived alongside animals and what that relationship reveals about us. So pour yourself a cup of tea, pull up a chair, and this one's going to get interesting. Let's start with what seems like a simple question. What's a pet? This should be easy. A pet is an animal you live with and you keep around for company. A dog, a cat, a parrot, a goldfish, these are pets. Across human history, animals have been kept for food, work, religion, status, and companionship, and these reasons blur together constantly. The ox that pulls your plow might also be the animal you cry for when it dies. The cat that kills mice in your granary might also sleep on your bed. The falcon that hunts for you might be a symbol of who you are. So when we say pet, in the strict sense, we usually mean something fairly specific. That is an animal kept mainly for companionship or pleasure. It's an animal that's fed but not eaten. We don't usually eat our pets. We sometimes give those animals names when we see them as individuals. We grant them a place inside human social life. And that idea that the pet is a beloved companion who is family but not food is more recent and more culturally specific than most of us assume. The bond between humans and animals is ancient. The institution of the modern pet, that isn't. Now keep that tension in mind because it's running through this entire story. Let's go back to the ancient past. We won't find pets there, but we will find domestication, which is a different thing. Domestication is the process of adapting wild animals and plants for human use, resulting in changes that make them more suitable for life alongside humans. The oldest case, by far, is the dog.
Please call him there now. No, please call him like that.
Somewhere between 15 and 40,000 years ago, wolves and humans began a relationship that would change both of us forever. The exact dates and places are still debated, but we know the order. The dog came first, long before agriculture, long before settled life. And the dog was domesticated by hunter-gatherers. So before we even farmed, before we built, before we wrote, we had dogs. Almost everything else came later, after farming began around 10,000 years ago. Sheep, goats, pigs, cows, and eventually horses. And these early domestications were driven mostly by utility. Animals were partners in survival. They hunted with us. They guarded us. They herded for us. They fed us and clothed us and even carried us. Cats most likely started associating with humans around 10,000 years ago in the Near East, drawn to the grain stores of early farmers and the mice that those grains attracted. Affection was there from very early on. Remember the young dog in the grave. That burial is around 12,000 years old. and you don't cradle an animal in death unless it meant something to you in life. So right at the beginning of the story, we find the two threads that will twist together for the rest of human history. That is utility and affection, use and love. They were never really cleanly separate. They were braided together from the start. So let's move forward into the first great civilizations, where we find animals kept for pleasure, status, and devotion. But it's always tangled up with wealth, power, and religion. In ancient Egypt, for example, dogs, cats, monkeys, and birds appear in art and tombs. Some clearly named and others are clearly mourned. And the cat, of course, ascends to something close to a god, associated with the goddess Bastet. They're sometimes mummified in staggering numbers. Was that pet keeping or was it religion? The honest answer is it's both, and the line between them barely existed. In Mesopotamia, dogs were linked to healing goddesses, and the elites kept exotic animals as displays of power. In Greece, dogs were prized for hunting and companionship, and caged birds were kept for pleasure. And philosophers argued over the moral status of animals. It's an argument that we've never really stopped having, though, is it? And then there's Rome, where something pretty close to modern pet keeping comes into focus. Wealthy Romans kept lapdogs and songbirds and ornamental fish. They kept exotic animals as raw displays of power and reach. They even wrote obituaries for their dogs, carved into stone, praising their loyalty and faithfulness in words that wouldn't really feel out of place today on a pet memorial. But notice a pattern that keeps repeating itself across the ancient world. Companion animals among the elite. Exotic animals are status symbols, and working animals belong to everybody else. Pet keeping in this fuller sense was often a luxury. It rode on the back of wealth and leisure. Here's where I want to point out a very common mistake. Because the history of pets is too often told as if it's a Western story. It isn't. In China, there's a long and sophisticated history of keeping ornamental fish, with goldfish selectively bred over many centuries into a living art, along with caged songbirds and small companion dogs like Pekingese that are tied to the imperial court. In Japan, there were very refined traditions that grew up around songbirds and ornamental carp, koi, and around small dogs, all shaped by a powerful sense of aesthetics. In the Islamic world, attitudes were complex and specific. Dogs were often regarded as impure in many interpretations, yet still valued for hunting and guarding. Cats, on the other hand, were widely esteemed and kept with much affection, with cherished traditions connected to the Prophet's reported fondness for them. And in Central America, dogs and turkeys were domesticated, with certain dogs holding both religious and companion roles. So the human-animal companion bond is pretty global, but its meanings and its rules differ enormously across cultures. Religion, class, and economy shape it everywhere. There's no single universal story of the pet. There are many. Back in Europe, in the medieval period, pet keeping gets caught between hierarchy and something a little darker. Aristocrats kept hunting dogs and falcons and lapdogs. Falconry in particular was a serious elite practice and a status marker. Lapdogs were associated especially with noble women and with nuns. And here we hit the first real wave of moral anxiety, because moralists sometimes attack this affection as frivolous, or worse, as love that should have been directed toward the poor or toward God, but was being squandered on a little dog instead. Interesting, isn't it? Loving an animal too much is a kind of moral error, a misdirection of care. And the suspicion could get even darker. During the witch panics, animals, especially cats, were sometimes linked to the demonic, which justified, at least in their minds, some really serious animal cruelty. And by the way, demonizing any animal or person can do that. So the medieval picture is a tense one. You have elite indulgence on one side, and moral and religious anxiety on the other. And even then, people sensed that there was something about loving an animal that needed to be reflected on and questioned and maybe even feared. So So now we go to another important part of the story. The period roughly the 18th and 19th centuries, especially in Britain and Western Europe, when the modern pet is basically born. Several forces come together all at once. First, you have urbanization and the rise of the middle class. Animals are no longer mainly economic partners for a growing slice of society. A prosperous bourgeoisie begins keeping animals purely for companionship and as markers of refinement and respectability. Secondly, you have the cult of domestic life and sentiment. The home becomes idealized as a moral and emotional sanctuary, and the pet becomes a part of that ideal, linked symbolically with children, with women, and the whole warm world of family. Third, you have a shift towards what you might call animal rights. Cruelty to animals started to be seen as a real moral failing. This gives rise to organized animal welfare, with the founding of the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals in Britain in 1824. And fourth, you have the rise of breeds. The Victorian era sees an explosion of selective breeding. There are dog shows and kennel clubs and breed standards, and the first major dog show is in 1859. The purebred animal emerges as both a beloved companion and a status object, a living thing shaped deliberately to match a human ideal of how it should look to us. And this right here I think is pretty revealing, because now the pet is, at the very same time, a cherished member of the family and a creature that's bred and confined and sterilized and managed and aesthetically engineered. We love it as family, but it's also owned as property, and we shape it to our own design. The geographer Yi-Fu Tuan looked hard at this cozy modern picture. In his book Dominance and Affection, The Making of Pets, he refused to take the warmth of pet keeping at face value. Don't assume, says Tuan, that love cancels out domination. Very often, he argues, love perfects it. His insight was to see that the pet belongs to a much wider family of things humans make and shape for their own pleasure. Think about things like gardens and bonsai trees, fountains or ornamental plants. We shape these things. We control them. We make them take on an appearance that is pleasing to us. We do the same thing with animals. And more disturbingly, certain hierarchical human relationships too. Think about the ways that powerful people have historically kept children and women and dependents in roles that mix both care with control. What unites all of these for Tuan is the satisfaction of taking another living thing and making it manageable, making it ours, making it fit our vision. Think about what we actually do to make a pet. We breed it for traits we like. We often miniaturize it. We make it dependent on us for everything. We prefer it to have a certain look, and we care for it under conditions of complete and total power over it. The pet, says Tuan, is not simply an animal we love. The pet is an animal we have made lovable, on our own terms, for our pleasure. And the tenderness we feel, it might be real, but it sits on top of a foundation of control. Love isn't the opposite of power. It can be one of power's most pleasant disguises. While Tuan points to the power that is often hidden inside of our love, the environmental thinker Paul Shepard points outward at what we've lost. For him, the deepest issue isn't domination in Tuan's sense, though that matters. It's that human beings have severed a vital relationship with wild animals, and that this rupture has damaged us. His underlying idea goes something like this. Human beings evolved in intimate relation to wild creatures. They're all around us. Wild animals are important because they were the other, different than us. They were autonomous. They were beyond our control. They're part of a larger order that doesn't revolve around us. And in Shepard's view, encountering that otherness was once central to human development, even to becoming fully human. Modernity shreds that relationship. We pave over the wild. We push it outside to the margins, and into the gap left behind we stick the pet as a kind of substitute. an emotional surrogate for a connection to wild nature that we no longer have. So for Shepherd, the pampered modern pet can be a symptom. It's a sign that we've grown so estranged from the real, untamed natural world that we've settled for controllable animal stand-ins, creatures we can manage and sentimentalize and bend to our own emotional needs. Now, that's a much harsher take than Tuan's. Tuan says that the pet reveals hierarchy hidden inside our affection. Shepherd says the pet reveals an entire civilization's arrested development, its retreat from wildness into safety, and ultimately a diminished version of nature. I think his point was about culture, about the powerful pull of modern society toward dependency and projection and a kind of domesticated unreality. He valued relationships with animals built on attention and respect, on encountering them as wild others rather than as emotional prosthetics. His critique is strongest, I think, when aimed at overbreeding, the confinement of animals, at a relentless anthropomorphism, and at treating animals as therapeutic accessories. There's a third voice I want to bring in, the art critic, novelist, and painter and poet, John Berger.
The small family living unit lacks space, earth, other animals, seasons, natural temperatures, and so on. The pet is either sterilized or sexually isolated, extremely limited in its exercise, deprived of almost all other animal contact, and fed with artificial foods. This is the material process which lies behind the truism that pets come to resemble their masters. They are creatures of their owner's way of life.
Here I'm drawing mainly from his famous essay, Why Look at Animals? Berger widens the lens even further. His argument is historical. He says that modernity has destroyed the older, everyday relationships between humans and animals. For most of human history, animals stood at the very center of human life, economically, symbolically, and mythically. They were our food, our labor, our gods, our omens, and our stories. And then in modern industrial society, they recede. They vanish from the center of daily life. And they survive, Berger says, only in altered, diminished forms. As animals in zoos, as spectacles, as images on screens and packaging, as commodities, and ultimately, as pets. So in Berger's framework, the pet is a remnant, one of the surviving fragments left behind after animals disappeared from shared public life. The pet is what's left when the ox, the wild herd, the sacred beast are gone and privatized down into a single creature in a single home, sentimentalized and made into a personal relationship after the older collective ones have all collapsed. Both he and Shepherd see modern pet culture as bound up with profound historical loss. But Berger's tone is more historical and more economic. He's more interested in the way industrial capitalism has reshaped the entire human relationship with the animal world. Now, if I stopped here, you'd be left with a pretty bleak picture. Keeping pets is domination. Pets are an ecological symptom. Pets are the sad remnant of a lost world. But I don't think that's the whole truth. And neither did Donna Haraway, professor emerita in the history of consciousness and feminist studies at the University of California.
Contrary to lots of dangerous and unethical projection in the Western world that makes domestic canines into furry children, dogs are not about oneself. Indeed, that is the beauty of dogs. They are not a projection, nor the realization of an intention, nor the telos of anything. Nonetheless, the status of pet puts a dog at special risk in societies like the one I live in. The risk of abandonment when human affection wanes, when people's convenience takes precedence, or when the dog fails to deliver on the fantasy of unconditional love.
Haraway is crucial because she disrupts the entire genealogy of suspicion and anxiety. She knows perfectly well that companion animals are bred, managed, and tangled up in human systems of power. She's not pretending the domination isn't there, but she refuses to accept the domination as the only truth of that relationship. Her key idea is that humans and companion animals are, in her phrase, co-constituted. We've shaped each other. over thousands of years through real and lived relationships. For her, dogs especially, aren't just blank screens for human projection. They're agents in their own right, with their own histories, their own capacities, their own ways of responding to us and changing us in return. Instead of the term pet, she uses companion species. And it's an attempt to escape two bad options. On the one side, the sentimental fantasy. My pet is basically my furry child, and our love is pure and uncomplicated. And on the other side, pet keeping is nothing but domination dressed up as love. She says, basically, it's neither. It's both. There's power, yes. There's breeding and training and control. But there's also communication and mutual adaptation, shared labor, real cross-species relationships. Something is actually happening between the human and the animal. It's not a one-way street. It's never fully innocent, but it's never entirely domination either. Across the 20th century, pet keeping became mass, commercial, and intensely emotional. Pets spread across every social class and became normal in ordinary households. A vast pet industry grew up around them.
A dog can get mighty hungry when he doesn't get his chuck wagon, because dogs love the soft meat-like chunks, the brown crunchy bits, the rich broth chuck wagon makes when you add warm water. Serve your dog chuck wagon. Chances are he's already waiting for it.
Commercial pet food and veterinary medicine, grooming, accessories, breeding, and eventually even pet insurance. And this is all very expensive. People began describing pets in family terms, members of the family, and later, fur babies. Animal welfare movements expanded, and animal rights arguments emerged alongside them. And in recent decades, all of this has only intensified. We have the deep humanization of pets with premium food and behavioral therapy, even attention to pet mental health. We have a massive global pet economy. We have a growing tension between rescue and adoption on one side and breeding on the other, along with sharp critiques of overbreeding and the inherited suffering it causes. We have a real scientific revolution in our understanding of animal cognition and emotion, which is reshaping how we think about what these creatures actually are and what they actually experience. So the contemporary scene is exactly the one our thinkers prepared us for. Pets are both more beloved and more commodified than ever before. We pour genuine love into them. We also breed them and buy them and confine them and build billion-dollar industries on them. Both things are true at once. And so a few patterns run through this entire history. Utility came first, but affection appears very early. The two are rarely cleanly separated. That young dog in the grave and the ox in the field belong to the same story. Pet keeping has also been long tied to status and surplus. Keeping an animal purely for pleasure often signaled wealth and leisure, from Rome to the Victorian drawing room. The pet as a sentimental family member is genuinely modern. It crystallized in the 18th and 19th centuries in urban, middle-class domestic culture. It's not ancient. Breeds in the pet industry are recent too, largely Victorian and later. Attitudes are deeply culturally specific, shaped everywhere by religion and class and economy, and there's no single story. And running underneath all of it, love and control have always coexisted. So on the one side stands the tradition of suspicion. We might put Twan, Shepherd, and Berger into that tradition. In this view, pets are evidence that human beings dominate what they love, that we sentimentalize dependence, that we replace wildness with controllable substitutes, that we've privatized and miniaturized the entire animal world down into something safe and manageable and ours. On the other side stands the reparative tradition, with Haraway as its sharpest voice. In this view, pets can also be sites of interspecies attachment, of real obligation and care. We share histories that aren't reducible to one-way domination. And I don't think you have to choose one side completely. I think probably the most honest position will hold both sides in tension. So let me end where I began, with that hand resting on the young dog 12,000 years ago. What was that, really? Was it love? Was it ownership? Was it the comfort of controlling something small and warm in a vast and dangerous world? Was it the beginning of a beautiful companionship? Or the beginning of a long history of remaking other creatures into the images of our own needs? I think the most honest answer, the one that respects both the history and the hard questions we've been raising, is this. It was probably all of those things at once, and it still is. When you look at your dog asleep on the floor or your cat curled up in a patch of sun, you're looking at the end point of a story tens of thousands of years long. A story of survival and use, but also of grief and tenderness and genuine connection across the gaps between species. The critics are right that we should be honest about the power in that relationship. We bred those animals, and we shape them. We make them depend on us. We hold nearly total control over their lives. To pretend otherwise is a kind of sentimental lie. But Haraway is right too, because something real does pass between us and them. Something that isn't just control. The animals look back at us. They respond to us. They change us, just as much as we've changed them. And maybe that's the truest thing we can say, that the bond is ancient and it's real, but it's not entirely innocent. It's love together with power. And maybe the most honest thing we can do is not to pretend the power away, but to hold it consciously and to wield it with as much care and respect for the creature's own life as we possibly can. This is dedicated to my little dog Molly, who passed away from cancer some years ago. She was the light of my life.